I have received some requests on a tutorial on how I use Windsurf. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how I set up my Windsurf IDE, which is currently my favorite IDE to do my daily coding. So I know that there's tons of tutorials already out there, but this is personally how I set it up. And as a bonus, I will show you how I set up my Claude Desktop as well, since I use it in pair to tackle some of the hardest programming tasks out there. So whether I'm building a web application, desktop app, or a Chrome extension, I use these tools for, I'd say, 95% of my coding tasks, and I rarely have to use Google search any longer. So if you're new here, my name is Dennis, and I've been a software developer for the last 18 years. And if you like this type of content related to coding, AI, and automation, please do consider subscribing to follow along my journey as we explore these AI tools together. So with that said, let's get straight into what Windsurf is and the basics. All right, so here's the things that we're going to be covering today. We're going to be covering the basics of Windsurf as far as like installation and pricing, comparing also with Cursor and VS Code just for momentarily. We're also going to go through the extensions and the left-hand panel. We're going to go through the helpful key shortcuts that will enable you to be productive inside of Windsurf IDE. Where I'm going to be showing you guys how to use the terminal, and I'm going to be doing a comparison between the chat versus the write feature within Windsurf. I'm also going to be showing you guys how to set up the MCP servers and the different servers that I use within the Windsurf IDE. I'm going to go through the settings of setting up Windsurf, including the MCP. We're also going to be covering the basics of Claude Desktop and why we need it. And also I'm going to be showing you guys the MCP server setup inside of Claude Desktop and what type of MCP servers I use and what I use it for. All right, let's quickly go through and walk you through the Claude Desktop, which is an application by Anthropic. Go ahead and download it for your specific operating system and then install it. Once you have it installed, you can go to your profile and set up certain things. Since I'm a developer, I set up engineering here. And then in addition to that, you can also include a certain preference. So this is going to be included as part of your conversation when you're using Claude Desktop. So certain things such as your coding preferences, what type of languages to use when you code, so that when it's time for you to ask certain questions, it's going to know which coding languages are you using. In addition, I also tell it to ask clarifying questions to make sure that it fully understands what I'm asking about before it comes up with a response. So it's really just a way for me to just do like a little bit of brainstorming with the tool so it can properly respond to my question. So I kind of add a little bit of context here and some things here so that it will pick it up when I ask some questions. Once you have Claude Desktop installed, you can see here that this is how it looks like. It's just a desktop application that basically you can use anywhere within your operating system, right? On the bottom right, you can pick here the latest model. So the reason why I like to subscribe to Claude Pro is because I can use the latest model, which is Claude Opus, which is like the smartest LLM that's currently available as of this recording. But you can also go back and use their Claude Sonnet 3.7 if you just want to have more conversation with Claude. So that's kind of one of the things that you can choose here. I just use Sonnet because it's quick, but if I'm going for a bit more complicated tasks where Sonnet 4 is not enough, I would switch to Opus 4. But generally, Sonnet 4 is good enough for 90% of the queries that I give or provide Claude. The next thing that I want to show here is the installation for tools. So you can see here that I have extended thinking toggled to be turned on so that it will think a bit more about the query before responding to it. So I always have it checked. And then for the web search, this is something that they just added just fairly recently, where you can allow it to do a web search for you. So instead of adding additional MCP servers such as Brave, it will figure out and you can tell it to go and scour the web for additional information so that it can best provide you with more real-time information regarding your query. So you can also set up and connect your Google Drive, email, and calendar search. But I believe this is reserved for Claude Pro subscribers. I'm going to be showing you guys how to connect that in a little bit. But the main thing here that I want to show you guys as far as the MCP servers that I mostly use is the Context 7, which will fetch for the latest documentation of any framework that you could be using, whether we're using the Next.js or ShodCN, any of those libraries or frameworks, the latest implementation of that specific library. So a lot of these LLM tools has been trained on older documentation. It's always good to have the latest documentation for that tool or library. So that's why Context 7 is useful. Another one that I also like installing on Claude Desktop is this thing called Desktop Commander, which I'll show you guys in a little bit how to install. But essentially, it will give you access to all these different tools. Mainly here, the read file, which will allow you to read the file. So it will have the same capability as Windsurf IDE, which sometimes I would switch to Claude Desktop for when I'm trying to debug something, because sometimes it doesn't really know how to solve certain issues. So I would switch to Claude Desktop for resolving some of the bugs, or if I'm doing some brainstorming, we'll have access to the project that I specify. So I'll just have to specify the project directory and then just tell it, okay, this is the project directory I'm working with. Can you let me know how to solve this specific issue? And it'll know it since you're granting it some access to your file system. So you can list out directory, you can move file, you can search files, you can edit blocks within a file, execute certain commands. So npx, npm install, certain things that you run usually on a terminal. You can run a read output, force terminals, list sessions, pretty much everything that you can do within the Windsurf IDE or Cursor or whatever IDE that you usually use. This will basically give Claude Desktop the same capability. That's why I like including it here. The next thing that I want to show you guys is how I find the MCP servers that you can use for either Claude Desktop or Windsurf IDE, right? So this is this website called smithery.ai. And there's like a bunch of other websites out there that you can also use for this type of purpose. So if you scroll down to the bottom where it says popular, the top two popular MCP servers as of this recording is the Desktop Commander and Context 7. So if you go to either one of these tools, it'll give you some information about the MCP server tool and also what kind of tools are being provided in it, as well as the API if you want to use it programmatically in your code, if you want to self-install it or auto-install it in your application. Some terminal commands here if you want to install it for Claude Desktop. If you're using Windsurf, for instance, you can run and copy this and then run it in your terminal to install it in that tool that you're using. If you want to install it manually, you can switch to a JSON here, which will give you the JSON object that you can paste into the Claude Desktop settings configuration file, which I can show you guys how to. But yeah, so it'll give you some stats here as what type of license this tool has, how many monthly tool calls this is being used for, and also the homepage of that specific tool and where the source code is, where everything is open source. So going back here, that's going to be Desktop Commander. And another tool that I've mentioned before was Context 7. So it will give you some information, which will tell you that this one is specific to fetching version-specific documentation. So it's going to give you the latest documentation. This is what it's useful for, since most of the time the LLMs are outdated as far as what type of documentation they had access to. So you just add this tool and then just tell it to get me the latest documentation of this, and it will know how to properly resolve any issues that you're having there, or installation, or anything that you need to know in terms of using that tool or library. So if you decided that you want to install the MCP server manually, you can go to the menu and go to the file and go to the settings. This is where you can set up certain things. You have to go to the developer, which will list out all the different MCP servers that you have installed in your Claude Desktop. So you can see here that I have activepieces Desktop Commander, Context 7, which I have a couple of versions that I have installed here. One has been installed automatically. So if you go and open and edit the configuration, it's going to look like this, right? So you're going to have the MCP servers. Then every single MCP server is going to be, you just have to paste the MCP server that you have here for Desktop Commander and then also for the Context 7. You're going to save it. And then you're going to have to restart your Claude Desktop in order for the Claude Desktop to recognize the new tools that you have installed. One of the primary ways that I use Claude Desktop for is solving a particular problem. So sometimes I would go back and forth between Windsurf and then Claude Desktop. So in terms of coding, I use it specifically for solving any problems, such as finding memory leaks in my application. So sometimes I just want to start out with a general statement. And you can see here the thought process that it gives back to us. It tells us, okay, the user is telling me to search Stack Overflow for how to fix a memory leak in the application. Since it has access to the web, I can specify that I want to be able to search Stack Overflow for this specific question that I have. You can see that it's looking at the preferences that we have provided in our settings within Claude's website. I'd be happy to help you search for memory leak solutions, but it adds here some clarifying questions instead of just assuming or making assumptions about the stuff that I'm asking about, such as what language or framework is your application using, and then what symptoms. It's actually asking a bit more questions so that it can hone in and specifically understand the problem that I'm experiencing. So I may incurring a memory leak based on web application or desktop application. They're totally separate type of application. So it's good that it's asking whether the application type is web application, desktop, or some sort of like database related issue. And then if there's any patterns that I'm noticing, there's anything that I can add in addition to it so that it can pinpoint and figure out what the best course of action is. In addition to that, it's also asking if I've done any sort of like tooling or profiling so that maybe I can add that as part of the query so that it can respond to it better. So I'm adding a bit of responses here. So the language that I'm using is C# using .NET 8. And the symptoms is regarding the API crashing. This is for a web application. And I have done some profiling, but it's not conclusive as to what the issue is. So I'm going to go into Opus here. So it asks some additional questions about the issue to help it troubleshoot the thing. So I went ahead and responded with some more clarifying questions, and then I did respond to it by responding to it again. I'm going to send back my response and see what it comes up with. All right, so you can see here, it didn't just provide with a solution to my problem. It actually added a bit more questions, as a memory exception is a bit more tricky to debug. So we added some questions such as what size or plan do I have? What type of memory profiling results did I get? And also there's certain things such as like what type of class did I use, HTTP client versus, or if there's any static collections that might be growing. So any potential issues that could lead to memory leak is also has been mentioned here. And then it gave me some diagnostic steps in order to resolve this issue, since there's really no straight path to resolving this. So it gave me some suggestion here as far as enabling the memory monitoring and then application insights telemetry. It also includes adding some monitoring here for the middleware. So give me some bunch of good options here. And then common fixes to check, such as the HTTP client, factory, and so on and so forth. The point of this is I use it to basically debug my code, or if I'm doing some brainstorming sessions before diving into a specific feature that I'm trying to code. So let's go over the differences between Windsurf, Cursor, and GitHub Copilot. So if you're on the fence in terms of using Windsurf, I just want to go over the pricing and some of the capabilities and features that you get when you're using Windsurf. So you can see here on the screen, Windsurf starts off at $15 per month, which is cheaper than Cursor, as you'll see in a little bit here. So with $15 per month, you're going to get 500 prompt credits per month, which will give you access to GPT 4.1. It'll give you access to Claude Sonnet 3.7, but you won't have access to Claude Sonnet or Opus 4 unless you bring your own key and put it in. So it's something to keep in mind. But you do have access to the proprietary model that Windsurf provides, which is SWE-1 model, which is, according to them, is slightly better than the Claude Sonnet 3.5. So you might have to test it out yourself and see which one you like. As far as in my use case, I personally haven't been using as much since I've been using Sonnet 3.7, mostly for my coding. If you want to play around with the different models, you can also use their SWE-1 model, which is currently for free. You can pretty much code for days without having to hit your credit limits for the month for Windsurf. If you want additional credits, you can purchase it for $10 per month, which gives you 250 credits. In addition to that, there's also some app deploys as well, since they have integration with Netlify. So this will give you 5 app deploys per day. Some of the things here that I quickly want to mention briefly that's not in either Cursor or GitHub Copilot is the preview, which is built in as part of Windsurf, which will allow you to preview the project that you're currently working with. So the next thing I want to go over is the Cursor. Cursor's IDE is something that I've used extensively for a while before Windsurf changed their credit system, since it was kind of expensive. Even though it's $15 per month, I often was running into the credit limit for the month. So I have to resort to using Cursor since they have a bit more credit. So for $20 per month that you get in Cursor, you get unlimited completions, 500 requests per month, which is now on par with Windsurf. You get access to unlimited slow requests per month. So even if you hit the limitations per month, you can still keep using Cursor. The next thing that I want to bring up here is GitHub Copilot, as they're one of the first ones that came on the AI coding scene. I've been using GitHub Copilot since day one. but they haven't really advanced in comparison to Windsurf and Copilot as far as innovation is concerned. But they're pretty much catching up. You can see here that the Pro version is significantly way cheaper than Windsurf and Copilot. And you also get to access them in the JetBrains IDE, Visual Studios. Since they're one of the first one that came onto the scene, you have access to Copilot in terms of VS Code, if you're using that, or if you're using Visual Studio, if you're a .NET developer, or if you're using some of the other tools, they pretty much have extensions for those. You can see here that their pricing is also significantly cheaper in comparison to Windsurf and Cursor. They're pretty much kind of giving away the tool for free at this point, but you have unlimited access to their ANET mode and chats. With the GPT 4.1, you have unlimited code completions, very similar to the Cursor counterparts. You have access to code reviews, which is not available in Cursor and Windsurf. You have access to Cloud 3.7 and also 4. The 4 is only available currently in GitHub Copilot and Cursor. And you have access to Gemini Pro, which all the tools have access to those models. Even though these tools are using the same models, I still feel like GitHub Copilot is still lagging behind in comparison to Cursor and Windsurf IDE as far as implementation. But that's just my opinion. All right, so let's get started with the coding. But for this demonstration purposes, let's set up a new project to better showcase what this tool is capable of. So when I start off with a project, so I have a blank folder. I like to start the project on a clean slate. I usually just start off the project. I usually just go and scaffold the code using the latest version, right? So if I'm using Next.js for my project, for my client-side code, I'm going to go to nextjs.org so that I get the latest command for that framework or that client-side code that I'm building, right? So in this case, I'm going to go to nextjs.org. I'm just going to copy this command. If you already have the command on top of your head, you can do that. So back into my terminal. So I'm going to open up the terminal and I'm going to paste that, which will allow me to create the new next project. So let's just scaffold the code from scratch. We can name this however we want. It's just going to be a coding demo, Windsurf demo. That's just going to be the project. We'll just go hit yes for TypeScript. And we'll just go hit yes, TurboPack yes, alias. I like to do it yes for that one. And we can always add additional alias later on. But the point of this is just basically just kind of go to the tool and how to set up Windsurf if you're just starting from the beginning. Hopefully you can pick up something from here that you can implement in your own IDE. So I'm just going to let this do its magic and we're going to go back after it's completed. All right, so after a few seconds, let's go back into here and we call it Windsurf. That's going to be the only one here. Let's go and open that up. Actually, I'm going to go in CD into Windsurf and then we're going to do Windsurf dot to open up that directory. So when you first open up Windsurf, this is what it's going to look like. So if you have used VS Code before, pretty much it's a familiar environment for you. So yes, I trust the author. We're just going to go ahead and apply it to all the files within the parent folder demo. So this is what the IDE looks like when you're first starting from the beginning. First thing that I also want to mention here before I bring up actually setting up Windsurf here is some of the shortcuts that can be useful here. So Control-Shift-P if you are on Windows, Command-Shift-P if you're on the Mac. So you can substitute this for your specific operating system. But so these commands at the bottom basically applies whether you're using Cursor, VS Code, or Windsurf. So they're pretty much identical across all of those in different environments, since they're pretty much the same variation of the same VS Codium IDE. So if you want to open up the command palette, will allow you to open up and perform additional actions within the Windsurf environment. You can go ahead and do a Control-Shift-P. So for some reason, if this write with Cascade is not available here, which is pretty much the tool that you can use to write your code. Let's say this is closed, you can do a Control-Shift-P and you can just type Windsurf here. So you can open up the Cascade window from here, right? So the other one that's also useful that you can use inside of Windsurf is this Control-P or Command-P if you're on a Mac operating system. So let's see how that works. So if I'm here, if I do a Command-P, so let's say I'm looking for the get ignore, I can go ahead and jump into that specific code without having to figure out where the file is nested within my project, right? So let's say I'm looking for something like about something regarding the layout, for instance, I can do Command-P and do a layout here, which will take me straight to that layout file, right? So that I can easily look at that file and work with it. Another one that's also useful here is to Control J if you want to toggle the terminal. So instead of going up here, which is you can just do Control J and it will open up the terminal. So you can have as many terminals as you want. You can have the PowerShell would be the default one for Windows, but if you want to open up, let's say Git Bash, you can also, you can see here that I have multiple terminals window running or terminal instances running here. So I have PowerShell and Bash. I can also add a command prompt here. So I can run multiple commands within the terminal within my project just by doing this, and I can manage and I can go back into the different instances of those terminal sessions, so which is kind of handy. Another shortcut that also can be useful is the Control L. So if you want to code with Cascade or you want to send code to Cascade, you can do a Control L. Let's take a look at how that works. So let's say if you want to send this code for some reason, you just want to send this to a code, you just highlight that code and do a Control L. This is going to send that snippet of code that you want to work with. So if you want to limit the context that you want to provide Cascade, let's say you're just debugging certain parts of the code, it's usually helpful to just give it the specific code instead of having to tell it which code it is, right? So whether you're on the terminal, for instance, let's say there's some error here, you can just copy that and write in the Control L, and any selection that you have within the terminal is also going to be sent to this window. So you can see here that there's an additional prompt here or context that's added as part of the prompt here, right? So that's kind of one of the shortcuts that I usually go to when I work with Windsurf. So if you can take away any of the commands here, I think the most useful ones are these sets of commands here. So Control P would be good if you're trying to write code. Control L if you're using Cascade a lot, especially if you're debugging or if you just want to send certain code to the Cascade window. Command or Control L would be a pretty useful keyboard shortcut. This one you don't have to worry about since you can run the terminal. Command Shift P is pretty much like the basic command that you need to know in order to access the different tools within Windsurf. All right, so let me walk you through the basics of using Windsurf, just in case you're not familiar with the IDE or VS Code in general. So let's focus on the left-hand side. So you've seen the Cascade on the right-hand side, but let's just focus on the basics. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the Explorer, you can click on it, which will collapse it. So if you're here, if you click on search, you can collapse it by clicking on this icon, right? So you have the Explorer, you have the search, which will allow you to pretty much like search, do a find here and do a replace. The next thing here is the source control. So they have a new feature here, which I just noticed, which will allow you to generate a commit message. So you can generate a commit message here based on the changes that you made within the files. So you can also collapse it as well. And you can see here the different changes and also the graph here with all the different changes that you've made if you're using a Git. If you're familiar with VS Code, they have pretty much almost the same extensions here. I noticed that some extensions in VS Code are not visible here. So there's a different marketplace, but out of the box, you don't really need a whole lot of extensions. I only need certain things such as C#, which I'm using an auto import. So that's going to be on the left-hand side. If you want to toggle the terminal, you can see here that you can click on the terminal and you can do a new terminal and you can do a split terminal. Same thing with splitting windows. If you're working in the same file and you want to split it in half, you can have access to those two windows within the same window. So which is pretty convenient. Same thing here, start debugging. There's not a whole lot of things here. If you used VS Code before, this should be all familiar to you. You can add folder to workspaces, which is if you have multiple projects within different folders, you can have it within the same workspace. So you have all the different projects into one workspace available for you. So it's kind of give you that a view. So open, save as. I always have auto save enabled here just to make sure that all my changes are saved and not lose work in the process. So we're going to close all. So let's focus on the Windsurf specific settings. So if you move over to the right-hand side, so there's two types of settings that you need to be aware of. One is specific to the IDE and one is specific to Windsurf. So the one specific to IDE is pretty much the text editor itself. So you can access it via the preferences here on the file and then under preferences, under settings. So you can access such as the text editor here, what the colors, what type of font, those kind of settings are going to be specific to the IDE. And the other settings that you need to be aware of is specific to Windsurf. So you can go to File, Preferences, and go to Windsurf Settings. These are the settings that are specific to Windsurf itself, such as where the marketplace is. You can see here that the marketplace here is basically a scope. That's what is available in the marketplace, what you can install within Windsurf. So if you wanted to point to a different marketplace, you can also change it here. And you can see here that the cascade, the plugins, the plans here, how many credits I have, all the different configuration here for the cascade, as far as allowing to run in the background, allow to auto-generate memories. So you can turn on and turn off some of these options here, and also some of the terminal auto execution. So I'm probably going to go over some of the settings here, but some are not very important, but let's just go over some of them. So terminal auto execution. So if you want certain commands, since Cascade has access to the terminal, it can perform certain actions in the terminal, such as to do an npm install, delete some files, and move things around. So you can allow it to basically execute some of these things. You can turn it off, or you can have it in auto. The turbo is always auto executed unless you add that specific command in your deny list, which we'll cover here in a little bit. The Windsurf preview, they have this feature where you can actually preview the actual application or the web application within the Windsurf IDE without having to go to the browser, which is kind of nice thing. So you can toggle this on. Some global rules, which we're going to go cover in a little bit here. So the global rules is something that you can set globally across multiple projects. The local rules is specific to that specific project. So if you have some rules that are specific to your web application that you don't want to go over into your desktop application that you're building, then you're going to have to put it here in the local rules. User interface, some hints. There's not a whole lot here. The Windsurf tabs for auto completion speed. So it's pretty much right now set to fast. This one doesn't really matter, just depending how fast you want this to go. When enabled, Windsurf will use the clipboard as context for completion. So if you have anything in your clipboard, Windsurf will also use that. So that's something that I probably don't care about at this point, since I can just paste it in the prompt here. Super complete, tab to complete. So some of these things I don't really care about, but let me show you the ones that I care about. So if you go into the general here, actually under the plugins, so if you go in manage plugins, by the way, you can list and go to these plugins. If you go to the right hand side, if you go here under the plugins on the top right of the Cascade window, you can also access here. And you can see here that there's a bunch of built-in plugins that's available within their source that you can install here. So I have the memory and the sequential thinking installed. You can also disable this if you want, or uninstall it. So I enabled those features or plugins here. If you want to enable the file system, MCP server, they make it super easy. So you don't need to any additional MCP server. Another thing that you can also install is Puppeteer if you're running some tests, some Git, if you need access to the Git repositories, if you want to commit and all that stuff. So you have access to all these MCP servers, which is pretty much what this is about. So you can either install it from their default store where you can install these tools, or you can pretty much go to the website that I showed you guys earlier. All right, so yeah, so this is the store, and this is where you can install your MCP server of choice. But let me close all of these real quick. Close to the right and manage plugins. So currently I have all these different MCP servers installed here in addition to my Claude Desktop. But the most important thing here is the context 7, which will give you access to the latest documentation of the library or framework that you're working with, Next.js, ShadCN, or any of the other libraries out there that you need to use for your project. So if you need to install additional ones, they make it super easy. You can view the raw config here. You can click on this view raw config, and it will open up the notepad or the configuration where you can add your MCP server. So once you do that, you just have to restart Windsurf, and then you'll have pretty much the tools or the MCP server tools available in Cascade. All right, so one thing I forgot to mention here under the Cascade settings here, if you go under the Cascade in the terminal auto execution, so you can actually click on this one. So if you set it on turbo, that means you're allowing all the commands inside of the terminal. You can do the turbo, but you have to add anything that you want to not execute in the terminal. So for instance, if there's anything that you don't want to allow, for instance, if you want to allow everything except for certain commands, you're going to have to add it in the deny list. For instance, let's say I don't want it to be performing the npm install automatically, I will add it here. And obviously I'm going to have to remove it from the allow list. So in the turbo mode, I will allow Cascade to basically execute any terminal commands except for the npm installs. So going back here into Cascade, you can set here the memories and rules. You can see that the Cascade memories here, the memories persist between the chat sessions and if you go back here to Cascade, and the write session. So anything that you write between write and chat is going to be persisted across the different conversations. So you can view the memories here, and you go to the memories tab. You can see that there's no memories yet since I haven't really used a Cascade in this specific project. Another thing here is the global rules. We talked about that before. You can edit the global rules here, where you can define a global rule. This will apply to other projects, not just this specific project. Right, it's just a markdown file that you can modify. And another one here is the local rules. You can add additional rules. I believe the windsurf rules is going to be deprecated at some point. So I'm going to give you a better way to set this up. So this is the old way of doing it. But if you need to specify the windsurf rules, which I highly recommend, you're just going to have to go back into Cascade here. So I'm going to close this windsurf settings. You're going to have to go into the customizations here in the Cascade window. So you're going to go ahead and click on customizations. And from here, you can define your rules. So you can do a global rules and then the workspace. So you can see here that it's a different user experience compared to the settings before. This will actually create a markdown file within the .windsurf rules directory. So if I say this is going to be specific to Next.js, if you look underneath the project, it created a windsurf folder, and one underneath that is another folder called rules, and then it created the Next.js markdown. So as far as the local rules, we can kind of go through it a little bit. So the activation mode, you have some options. So the manual one is if you want to set these rules for a specific prompt that you would want to use. So you can include this mode if you just want to include this rule for certain prompts that you do. There's other ones where it's always on, meaning that any prompt that you provide into Cascade, this specific rules is always going to be applied and sent to that prompt. Another one is going to be the activation mode of model decision, which means that the model will decide whether to apply the rules, which is kind of nice too. You have to apply a description here so it knows whether to apply the rules or not. And then you can add your content here as that rule is going to be set up. And another thing here that you can also set up here is you can also define certain patterns. So this is going to be the glob type of pattern where you can specify pretty much like a wildcard of what type of files this specific rule is going to be applied to, right? So if you have some TypeScript files that you want this to be applied to, you can pretty much apply a glob pattern and the content and the rules that you define for those specific files. As far as windsurf rules, this is something that you'll have to refine and come up with over time. So you can refine this within your team. So let's say you are working with a team and you have specific rules as how you have your naming convention or how you're architecting your project. This is where you put it, and it's something that you can discuss with your team. If you're working solo, you can define your rules as how you want Cascade to basically generate the code and where to place those codes and so on and so forth. So I've talked about this in my previous video of how I like to organize my project within certain folders and have certain conventions in place. However, there's some websites out there that you can go take a look at and reference. So you don't have to build your windsurf rules from scratch. One of the websites that you can go to is this windsurf.com/editor/directory, which will give you an example rules that you can apply to your project. So for instance, if you're writing in Next.js, it'll give you some convention. Obviously, you're gonna have to like tweak it and refine it according to your preference. It can give you some good starting point as to how to create rules for yourself. So this is specific to Next.js and Shadzi and UI. So if you're using React Native and TypeScript, you can use this general coding style. And there's some other examples here as well. They have one for front end, they have one for data science and machine learning. If you're a new coder, if you're trying to learn how to code, this is a good one. And there's some other resources out there as well, such as the playbooks.com/windsurf-rules, which will give you some good windsurf rules that you can use for your project, such as this one. So if you're using Next.js, it will give you some ideas here as how you can set up your Next.js rules, such as using app router. If you're using that, client components must be explicitly marked with use client at the top of the file, which is a good rule to have. So that's kind of one of the rules that you can use here. Let's use this and copy this into our project. Let's copy this and let's go back into Windsurf and paste that in. And then for this one, you can see here that it's using the glob pattern. I'm going to just copy that and apply it here. And then for description, there's no description here. I can just keep the description right there. Yeah, so description, I can just remove all that. So basically when I save that, that's going to be saved into the Next.js markdown rules inside of Windsurf. So next time I open this up, next time I do a prompt here, this Next.js rules is going to be applied to all the files that has this extension, and that's going to be automatically sent into Cascade when I write a command. Next thing I want to bring up here is the model that you can use. So by default, you can see here that the Claude 3.7 Sonnet thinking has been selected. So the model that you choose will basically define how much credit is going to cost. So if you're using the SWE1, it's going to be free for the time being. And then GPT 4.1, it's going to cost you 0.25 credit. So you're going to have to pick and choose which one will work best. To me, the best one at the moment is 3.7 Sonnet or 3.7 Sonnet Thinking. Sonnet Thinking will cost 1.25 credit, which will cost more. But if you're running some code and you don't want to run out of credits, you can pretty much stick with SWE1, which will give you unlimited credits for the time being. Another thing to consider here is the difference between write and chat. So if you're just chatting, if you're doing some brainstorming session, if you want Cascade to tell you the project structure, you can ask for certain things about the project. You want to learn about the project a bit more, you want to do a chat. The chat is basically not going to do any changes in your local file system, while the write is pretty much it's going to perform all these actions. It's going to write the code and it's going to make a bunch of changes. So I usually start off with a chat just to kind of open up the conversation. And then before making any changes, making sure that the Cascade agent understands what I'm referring to and what the context is of what I'm asking about. And then I go ahead and switch to write, which I can just say, hey, let's perform those actions that we talked about, right? So this is the prompt. You can add and attach an image by clicking on the image icon. You can also do an add here if you want to attach a certain context. So for instance, if you want to give Cascade URL to a website to give it a bit more context, you can do that with an add web. You can also type it here directly. So you can do add, and then it will give you a bunch of items such as access to files, directories. There's also some built-in documentation such as the Windsurf help documentation. There's some Perplexity API docs. His docs. So there's a bunch of different docs here, which will give you the latest documentation for the library that's out there. All right, so going back to the rules here. So if you're using something like, if you have it manual, for instance, like this, let's say you want to add certain rules manually yourself, you can do an add here, and then you can say rules, and then you can specify, since I only have one rule, which is Next.js, I can attach that. If you want more control over what's being sent as part of the prompt, you can do a manual here. So if there's anything that you don't want to be sending to Cascade every single time, you can just set to manual, and then you can do an add here, and you can just say for the rules, I only want to include this for certain things, certain prompts that I do, right? So that's how you attach additional context to the prompt. Another thing that you can also do here is you can access MCP servers we talked about before. So if you go and click on the MCP servers, so you can see here that the available tools here. So if I want to use a certain MCP server, so I can just specify use context 7 to access certain documentation for a certain library. So I would spell it out and say, hey, use this context 7 tool to get access to the latest documentation regarding this library that I'm using. Go ahead and fix this or implement a certain component, for instance. One thing that also is available here is preview as well. So you want to preview your code, you can do that by clicking on this preview. You can start in preview. So this is going to open up the browser preview of the website without having to open up a new browser. So it's going to figure out, it's going to go to the file system. It's found a package.json and went ahead and analyzed it, and it determined that this is a Next.js project. So went ahead and run it. So it run this command nextdev -- turbopack, and then it's now starting. So it's kind of running its own environment. Now you can open a preview, which will give us a preview of what this website that we just scaffolded in Next.js, what it's going to look like. So you can see here that I can send elements. So I can click on certain elements. I can send that specific part of the website into the context here. So now that specific element that I just highlighted in the preview window has been sent to the cascade window, which is kind of pretty neat. Right, so I can go ahead and do that by highlighting certain things. So let's say I just want to change this, or I want to change certain text. So let's say I want to change the text for this specific block of code. I can just say, change this to this text. So I can pretty much do that without having Cascade having to go through all the entire file system. So it will specifically know which element or which part of the website you want to be changed. So that's kind of handy. Another thing that I want to go through here before we wrap this up is you can also deploy this. Since they have a Netlify integration, you can click on this rocket ship and then it says deploy your application. If you want to deploy this and if you want to show this to your friend and show them what you built, you can click on this. And this is going to go ahead and create a deployment file that's going to be added into your project. So this is going to define the blueprint of how it's going to be deployed into Netlify. So you see here a little bit how it looks like. So currently it's deploying the website. You can see what it's generating for us. So you can see here that it figure out the project here. It says the deployment configured, analyze, and this is the project. I'll help you deploy your next application. So it was able to determine what type of application we're building. We'll need to create a Netlify configuration file first, and this will help Netlify understand how to build and deploy your next application. So it created that file, which you can click. So you can see that the build command, the type of build environment, and also the plugin that's going to be used is specific to Netlify. And then it even created a custom domain that you can access from anywhere. So now it's creating and preparing to upload the 20 files. Now it's asking, do you want to deploy this web application? We're going to just click on deploy. All right, so notice here, I noticed there was an issue with the deployment. The subdomain WHISPR is already taken. So it went ahead and generated a new custom domain. Let's click on deploy once again. So now it's uploading the files. Right, great news. Your next JS application is being deployed. Here are the details. It'll give you the project ID, deployment status. So currently at this stage, it's still deploying. So if you click on this deployment URL, it might not be available since it's still building. It just pushed the files into the server and now it's being built. And then after that has completed, it's going to deploy it. So just for completeness, you can see here that it created a netlify.toml file, which will give an instruction to Netlify on how to build this project. And another one is a Windsurf deployment.yaml file, which will basically include the project ID and the framework that this project is built on. All right, so let's actually click on the deployment URL and let's open it up in the browser and see if it's already available. So you can see here that the site is not found yet. So you're gonna have to wait for a little bit until it's ready. We can check out the deployment status, however, and click on that and see the progress of the deployment. So it's gonna take us straight to Windsurf's deployment site, and it's going to give you a real-time status of the deployment of our project. So from here, you can actually view the build logs. It'll give you the version, the current directory. This is going to be the same terminal output that you'll see when you build the project. You can see here that it's generating static pages, 0 out of 5, and so on and so forth. So these are the output that you get when you're building the project. And then you can claim the application if you want to claim this project, but you don't have to. So you can refresh this again since it says that the deployment has completed. So you can see here that the project has been successfully deployed to a custom URL that you can share with your friends or family. All right, so one last thing that I want to discuss here. So every time you want to create a conversation with Cascade, you're just going to go ahead and start a new conversation here. So when you're starting a brand new feature or you're solving a different problem, make sure you create start a new conversation so that it starts over again. So you're not mixing up the prompts with a different prompt, just to kind of keep the context of the conversation small and to the point. So that's kind of one of the tips that I would like to share with you guys. So if you need to go back to a previous conversation, you can always go back here into the all conversation. It will give you straight back to where you came from. So that's kind of one of the things that I want to showcase here. And if you need to go back and roll back into the previous version of the code, there's always a rollback feature, which is not available since there's nothing here that I did. But if it made some modifications to the code, it will give you a restore point, which will allow you to restore the code from a previous version. But overall, when you're starting a new project, make sure that you're using Git source control to make sure that you can actually properly put your code and restore it to a proper checkpoint if you're making some drastic changes. So that's going to be it for today. I hope that this video has been insightful. And if you'd like to see more videos such as this one, I would like to see you as one of my subscribers. And I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.